Good morning, Web Summit. I want to talk today about AI and the future of our industry, and actually pick up on that last talk in terms of who's really in charge. And, right now, we can build amazing stuff with AI. We are building amazing stuff with AI. But we're building on rented land. We're building on land owned by somebody else. And I want to talk about a different future, what I think is a better future, where we own that land, where that land is open source, where there's a common set of building blocks. And to kick it off, I'll kick it off with my friend Sam. And he said something kind of surprising, kind of remarkable a few months ago, that he thinks that OpenAI has been on the wrong side of history, and that he needs to figure out a different open source strategy. And of course, he was reacting to the release of DeepSeek and sort of this idea that open models are catching up. They might be chipping away at his moat. But I think he was also reacting to something much, much bigger. He was reacting to the fact that developers, startups, when all else is equal, would rather own what they build and not rent and be beholden to underlying platforms. And AI APIs, that is renting. If you're successful, your costs are going to go through the roof, and moving off of them is actually going to be very difficult. Whereas open source, it's actually about owning what you build. You can change it, you can renovate it, you can take it somewhere else, and if you are successful, you have much more control over the costs. And that is the future that I think we want in AI, one where we own what we build. But we're really in a fork on a road where we have to choose between those things. So I'm going to talk about the future where we choose owning what we build. But before I talk about the future, I'm going to talk about history, because we've actually had to make this choice before. So we'll go back to 1997. That is when I first started making web apps. The first web app I made, or kind of website that was interactive I made, was an e-commerce site for a vitamin store. And at the time, the easy and popular choice was to build on the Windows stack. Microsoft programming tools, Microsoft databases, Microsoft web servers, and of course, Microsoft Windows. And it's kind of actually hard to imagine. Well, Microsoft was kind of growing quickly. It was still an upstart in server operating systems. Almost 50% of the market share was still owned by Novell, SEO, and Sun, companies that probably nobody here remembers, but these were the dominant players of the time. They were also hard to use, very expensive, which is kind of why they don't exist anymore. And Microsoft, which was really trying to take control of the web, and did for a period, was doing something that was easy for developers and way more cost effective. Now, of course, Linux at the time was, starting to grow. But despite the fact that it was free, it was also difficult to use back at that time. Much harder to build things with the Linux ecosystem. And to me, and I think to many others, it felt kind of risky, not ready for prime time. But, I had to take that risk at a certain moment. Later in 1997, and the reason this is very pixelated is I had to go dig this up from the Wayback Machine, I worked on a project called the Action Apps, which was basically a content management system for organizations around the world that offer web hosting to nonprofits, to people like Greenpeace, to Amnesty, thousands of nonprofits around the world. And we just wanted to make it easier for them to make websites, manage websites. So think of what we were building was like an early version of WordPress, but with a lot of content sharing between these nonprofits. And my assumption was, when I kind of went to the team, and this is like 10 different organizations around the world, let's just build on the Windows stack. That's what we're doing. It's easy. They screamed at me. They're like, no way. This is not what we're doing. We want to build on open source. We want to release this as open source. And it's kind of hard to imagine it from now, but that was sort of a new concept to most people. Open source was still young. It wasn't mainstream. And that was partly a values-driven push on their part, but it was also, and I think primarily, because they wanted to make sure that we would own what we built. They didn't want to pay for the whole Windows suite of licenses as we went to those 10 countries or as other people adopted what we build. They wanted to just build it and be able to use it and to be able to own it. And, we didn't just go to Linux itself. We used the whole LAMP stack. Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. And these are not all the most modern technologies that everybody builds on today. But this was what people started to turn to and shifted the tide. And it had everything that the Microsoft stack had. You had to work a little bit harder. But in working harder, we had the freedom to build something great and unique. We built stuff that we just actually couldn't have built with Linux. And Action Apps had about a 10-year run as really the leading content management system for nonprofits around the world. And, it wasn't only us making this choice. And remember that, it wasn't just us making that choice. Others were doing it as well. Linux was starting to grow. This 6% was growing. Many people were choosing Linux, the Linux ecosystem, the LAMP stack. There were others that were actually taking a bigger step. And this is not as big a monitor as I hoped I would have. So I'm going to have to tell you what you're seeing here. This is a graphic from Wired magazine. It used to do these cartoony graphics in about 2005. And what you see is all of these open source projects attacking the Microsoft castle. And these people were taking a bigger step. It was, most of the LAMP stack projects, also Firefox. And, Firefox, of course, a delivery vector for JavaScript, which wasn't the dominant thing at the time. People were building with Microsoft's equivalent ActiveX. All these folks were trying to create something very different. And they were a kind of a rebel alliance of sorts who believed they could shape the future. And I think that's the moment we're at right now. They believed there was a fork in the road, and they believed it was possible to create a future on open building blocks to own what we build. And, we live in many ways in the future that they imagined. If you're a developer today, you probably have some part of the Linux ecosystem that you're building on, even if it's in a CSP. So how many people in your company and what you do have some piece of the Linux ecosystem underneath what you build? Just kind of raise your hands. Most people and the rest of you are lying. It is what underpins what we build today. It is what the default is for startups, for developers. And getting to this default, that was not inevitable. It was because that Rebel Alliance imagined a different future, and they built it. And, there's a huge value that has been created for developers, for startups, for society as a result of that. This thing that you really can't see, I'll show you a bigger number in a second, is a paper by a Harvard economist, Frank Nagel. And he looked at the value created by the open source ecosystem, the kind of value created by this Rebel Alliance over the last few decades. And if you look at the supply side value, basically how much it cost to build the open source ecosystem, and this actually excludes some operating system elements, it's $4 billion that it costs. So kind of we've invested $4 billion of money and labor in this ecosystem. But the demand side, the value created for developers, for startups and society, how much do you think the demand side was, the value to all of us? $8 trillion. $8 trillion with a T. So that means it would have cost us $8 trillion more as an industry to build what we've built had there not been this Rebel Alliance, had there not been the open source ecosystem that we build on today. It's an incredible number. And if you just think about the LAMP stack, which is a tiny piece of that, and you think of stuff that was built on the LAMP stack, yes, Wikipedia, WordPress, but also Facebook, maybe those things wouldn't exist today if that hadn't happened. So there's a huge accelerator of what has built the modern internet in the open source ecosystem. It's really been very powerful, and it's created a tremendous amount of value in the digital economy for all of us. So let's come back to now and look at the future. I think we all need to figure out a different open source strategy for AI. And that is not going to happen on its own. It involves choices, It involves intentionality. We need to do for AI what we did for the web. And that actually is exactly what Mozilla is trying to do right now, along with others, along with, I think, a growing Rebel Alliance. We are rewiring ourselves, reinventing ourselves to do in the AI era what we did as Mozilla in the web era. And that means making open source, open standards the default, decentralizing things, helping developers own what they build. And if you're going to go back to Sam, he was saying DeepSeek is a sign that we're already moving in this direction, and I agree. And it's not just DeepSeek, of course. The big tech companies, take Llama as one example, are building open weights models. But actually more interesting to me, this one Olmo you may not have heard of by the Allen Institute in Seattle, is a truly open LLM. That means the underlying data, the pre-training code, the pre-training checkpoints, the weights, like all of it is truly open end-to-end, meaning you can own it and trust it. And that stuff is happening. It's catching up. It's real. People are using it. But, of course, we know AI isn't just about the models. Just like Linux or building on the Linux stack is not just about the Linux kernel. And that's why the way I think about it is what we need is like a LAMP stack for AI. We need open dev tools, data, models, and compute. And the good news is there's sort of a Rebel Alliance already forming around this stuff, around this idea for a LAMP stack for AI. They're not using that language necessarily, and I think we do need a common North Star and a vision, and it's something like this. But when you think, there's a lot of startups and developers building parts of this stack today, just like that, funny Microsoft diagram from Wired in 2005. Think about LangChain, OpenRouter, DeepEval, BentoML, Ollama. These are all projects that are filling in parts of that stack. And Ollama, interestingly, which lets you run Llama and other models on a local machine, in 2024, it was the fastest growing project on GitHub. So there is momentum. And, there's still a challenge, though, and that's a big part of our focus at Mozilla right now. There's still actually a big challenge in open source AI being successful. It is still way more technically complex, way harder to use than the API-driven models. I think most developers, even many things that we do, you're going to turn to the API when you need something simple or when you want to build your business. And you can use open source for some things. I think you can use it for more things than you think today. But much like, I turned to Windows back in 1997 when the Linux ecosystem was already starting to emerge, it's easier to build on one of the big APIs. And so we are rewiring Mozilla to tackle this, to help open source AI become the default for developers. And I'll just give you 3 quick things that we're doing. We've spun off a separate company called Mozilla AI, a public benefit corporation that is focused on making it easier to consume the open source AI ecosystem. Think about it as being like a Linux distribution for open source AI. We've set up a separate data organization, a social enterprise called the Mozilla Data Collective, which uses a Wikipedia-style way of collecting training data so people have ethical training data sets that are also more diverse, very niche, really important as you build things like small models. And then, of course, Firefox, we're starting to experiment with what it means to build AI kind of on our terms, with the values in the Mozilla Manifesto. And there's bits of that you can see now. You can see how you can not only choose, say, ChatGPT in the Firefox AI sidebar, but you can also choose Mistral. And you'll see more of that over the coming years. Early next year, you'll see something emerging in Firefox. It's going to be really exciting. And I won't steal the show. You should go see Laura Chambers talk, our Mozilla Corporation CEO, tomorrow. So all of those things are things where we are pushing ourselves. We are rewiring ourselves to think differently, bring in different talent to figure out how can we use AI in a different way, have open source be at the center of things. But in addition to rewiring ourselves, we're also rewiring our money. We've built about $1 billion in reserves up, which is not a lot by AI scale, but is a lot for a little nonprofit that tries to do tech differently over the last few years. And we're not just investing that in our own work. we're investing in other double bottom line tech companies that are a part of this Rebel Alliance. And so 3 years ago here at Web Summit, we launched Mozilla Ventures to work with those other companies, to back them, to help them to grow the alliance. And so let me just give you 3 companies that are examples of this. One of them is Hugging Face, which you probably heard of. You know, they're like kind of almost a center of gravity for open source AI, like a GitHub for open source AI. And they work at both the model layer. You can go and find all kinds of models at Hugging Face, and the data layer. You can go find all kinds of data sets. And actually, Hugging Face also now owns a open source robot company. It's very interesting. So that's one example. Another is this company, Flower AI. And they're building a whole different architecture and economics for compute that is built around technology called federated learning, which lets you kind of build on the edge on local devices, but also lets you distribute training loads and inference across many different computers. So not like at the data center or chip level, but really trying to rewire how the compute part of that stack works, and everything they do is open source. And then there's a third company I'll talk about called Umi, which is a bunch of big tech engineers, researchers who have left to start their own company. And what they're trying to do is give people developer tools that let you train custom models in hours and not in months. And all of that is open source. And what I love about Umi beyond what they're building is they have a big, hairy, audacious goal kind of mission. They want frontier level open source AI models to be accessible to everybody. And that's something I can totally get behind. Really excited to work with them. So that's just 3 of the 50 companies we're working with. This alliance is growing. There is momentum around open source AI. And I'll also say it's not just startups and developers. Governments are going there. We recently joined, this is the logo for the Digital Public Goods Alliance of the UN, and we recently joined that group, which is governments and nonprofit organizations building up these kind of open components, these open building blocks for the open source, for the AI era. And there's also, I love what Germany has done, the German Sovereign Tech Fund, which when Germany uses open source technology, they actually fund back the open source projects that they work on. And I underline those because it's really critical here in Europe, where there's a debate around tech sovereignty and kind of AI sovereignty, that you build on open source, that governments understand they need to invest in and build on open source if they want sovereign, independent tech. So just to wrap up, if you look at the headlines, if you look around, and the headlines are filled with OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft, Google, it's easy to think that open source AI is a sideshow. And when you think about only 14% of startups use open source AI, it's easy to maybe think that the market is small. But that's the mistake that I made in 1997 about Linux. And it's the reason that I think about this statistic quite differently. 14% of startups already use open source AI. And that gives me hope, that gives me ambition. We're well past where Linux was in 1997, and we're picking up speed. So, what's it going to be in the next few years or the next 25 years? As the bubbles burst, as AI technology just becomes a part of everything we do? I don't know. But I think there's going to be a lot of twists and turns. There's going to be an opportunity to build some great open source AI tech, some amazing open source AI companies, and there's going to be an opportunity to create a huge amount of value. How much value? I don't know. But if you think about having a common set of building blocks, if you think about owning the things we build, the amount of value we can create can be breathtaking. And that's a future we can choose, one where we do own what we build, where open source AI becomes the default. But it is not inevitable. We need to choose it. And there's 2 choices we need to make. One is choose open source AI when you're building things, if you're a developer. Invest in companies that are building on open source AI or that are building part of this open source AI stack if you're an investor. And as I said a moment ago, if you're a government, get real about tech sovereignty. You can only do it if you have open source underneath And if you want it in AI, it means open source AI. And then there's one other choice we all need to make. And that is really to band together if we want this future. And the thing I would just say to all of you, if you want this future, join us. Thanks very much.